Hey, welcome back to Atreyu News. This is happening outside the Gorsuch hearing. Lots of support. A hearing for Judge Neil Gorsuch starts today. Gorsuch supporters are showing their full support. Excellent. A beacon of light in the darkness. We can never replace Justice Scalia, but we can ensure his legacy lives on. The hearing of Judge Neil Gorsuch starts today. More from Teddy Cruz. I wasn't a huge fan of him in the primaries for obvious reasons, but hey, I'm coming around.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Gorsuch, welcome. Thank you for your decades of service, honorable service. Thank you for your family being here today. And thank you for your willingness to endure the spectacle of this confirmation hearing. February 13th of last year was a devastating day for those of us who revere the Constitution and the rule of law. On that day, we lost Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Justice Scalia was one of the greatest justices to ever sit on the court. He was a trailblazing advocate for the original meaning of the Constitution and a shining example of judicial humility. His death left an enormous hole not only in our hearts, but in the protections for the rule of law. And it left enormous shoes to fill. A daunting task that I know weighs on you as you consider the enormity of what is in front of you. Today, there is a sharp disagreement about the very nature of the Supreme Court. Some people view the court as a hyper-powerful political branch. When they grow frustrated with the legislative process and the will of the people, they turn to the courts to try to see their preferred policies enacted. For conservatives, we understand the opposite is true. We read the Constitution and see that it imbues the federal judiciary with a much more modest role than the left embraces. Judges are not supposed to make law, they are supposed to faithfully apply it. Justice Scalia was a champion of this modest view of the judicial role. But had his vacant seat been filled by Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton, Justice Scalia's legacy would have been in grave danger. If they had filled his seat, we would have seen a Supreme Court where the will of the people would have been repeatedly cast aside by a new activist Supreme Court majority. We would have seen a Supreme Court majority that viewed itself as philosopher kings who had the power to decide for the rest of us what policy should govern our nation and control every facet of our lives. We would have seen our democratic process controlled by 5 unelected lawyers here in Washington, D.C. That would have been a profound and troubling shift in the direction of the Supreme Court and in our nation's future. That is why, after Justice Scalia's untimely death, the Senate chose to exercise our explicit constitutional authority. And we advised President Obama that we would not consent to a Supreme Court nominee until the people, in the midst of a presidential election, were able to choose. For 80 years, the Senate had not filled a Supreme Court vacancy that had occurred in a presidential election year, and the Senate majority rightly decided that last year would not become the first in 8 decades. The people, therefore, had a choice between an originalist view of the Constitution represented by Justice Scalia or a progressive and activist view of the Constitution represented by Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. During the campaign, President Trump repeatedly promised to nominate justices in the mold of Justice Scalia. And indeed, he laid out a specific list of 21 judges, constitutionalists from whom he said he would choose his nominee. Judge Gorsuch was one of those 21. Issuing such a list was a move without precedent in our country's presidential history. And it created the most transparent process for selecting a Supreme Court justice that our nation has ever seen. The voters had a direct choice. The voters understood the 21 men and women from whom the president would pick. And they had a very different vision of a Supreme Court justice that was put forth by Hillary Clinton. And in November, the people spoke. In what was essentially a referendum on the kind of justice that should replace Justice Scalia, the people chose originalism, textualism, and rule of law. The people chose judicial humility. The people chose protecting the Bill of Rights, our free speech, our religious liberty, our Second Amendment, rather than handing policymaking authority over to judges on the Supreme Court. Given that history, given the engagement of the electorate nationally on this central issue, I would suggest that Judge Gorsuch is no ordinary nominee. Because of this unique and transparent process, unprecedented in the nation's history, his nomination carries with it a super legitimacy that is also unprecedented in our nation's history. The American people played a very direct role in helping choose this nominee. Like the renowned justice he is set to replace, Judge Gorsuch is brilliant and has an impeccable academic record. His judicial record demonstrates a faithful commitment to the Constitution and the rule of law. He has refused to legislate his own policy preferences from the bench, while recognizing the pivotal role the judiciary plays in defending the fundamental liberties protected in the Bill of Rights. On the night he was nominated, Judge Gorsuch channeled Justice Scalia when he explained that, quote, "A judge who likes every outcome he reaches is very likely a bad judge, stretching for results he prefers rather than those the law demands." That is exactly right. And those words should give comfort to the American people and to my Democratic colleagues. And it's worth recalling that our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle understand this, and indeed, not too long ago, agreed with it. A decade ago, Judge Gorsuch was confirmed by this committee for the Federal Court of Appeals by a voice vote. He was likewise confirmed by the entire United States Senate by a voice vote without a single Democrat speaking a word of opposition. Not a word of opposition from Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, not from Harry Reid or Ted Kennedy or John Kerry, not from Senators Feinstein, Leahy, or Durbin, who still sit on this committee, not even from Senators Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, or Joe Biden. Not a one of them spoke a word against Judge Gorsuch's nomination a decade ago. And the question this hearing poses to our Democratic colleagues is, what has changed? What has changed? 10 years ago, Judge Gorsuch was so unobjectionable, he didn't merit even a whisper of disapproval. In the decades since, he has had an objectively exemplary record. By any measure, he has shown himself to be even more worthy of the bipartisan support he received back then. Unfortunately, modern reality suggests that's probably not something my Democratic colleagues feel they can do in today's political environment. Many probably believe they have no choice but to try to manufacture attacks against Judge Gorsuch, whether they want to or not, just to preserve their own political future and protect themselves from primaries back home. We're seeing some of these baseless attacks already. Most recently, some Democrats have tried to slander Judge Gorsuch as being, quote, against the little guy because he has dared to rule based on the law that Congress has passed, and not on the specific identity of the specific litigants appearing before him. This is absurd. For one thing, many of these same critics have spent the last 8 years attacking the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic charity of nuns, for having the audacity to live according to their deeply held religious beliefs. You really need to take a long look in the mirror if one day you find yourself attacking nuns, attacking the Little Sisters of the Poor, and then the next day you find yourself orating on the need to protect the little guy. A judge's job is not to protect the little guy or the big guy. A judge's job, and a judge swears an oath to uphold the Constitution and to follow the law fairly, impartially, and equally for every litigant, little or big. In the past weeks as well, some of my Democratic colleagues have questioned Judge Gorsuch's independence and suggested that he needs to answer questions about the actions and statements and even the tweets of the president who appointed him. I would ask, was Justice Ginsburg or Justice Breyer asked about the sexual harassment suit that had been filed against President Clinton by Paula Jones? No, neither was asked about that suit. Was Justice Kagan asked about President Obama's incendiary comments at the State of the Union attacking the Supreme Court for a decision he disagreed with? No, of course not. Those questions were not asked because they were inappropriate political questions that have nothing to do with the record of the nominee before this committee. Justice Ginsburg, Justice Breyer, Justice Kagan were not asked those questions, and Judge Gorsuch should not be either. Instead, we should evaluate this nomination on the record, on the merits, and on that ground, I have every confidence that Judge Gorsuch will be confirmed as the next Associate Justice of the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Senator.
Wow, that was a beautiful speech, packed with truth. Ted Cruz bringing the heat. Judge Gorsuch, from my own research, from every single level, it appears he is a true, real American hero, American champion, and I look very much forward to seeing his reign on the Supreme Court.